Howdy folks, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I am your host, the Mighty Bjorn, and today for you folks, I have a brand new Star Trek Adventures video, because I'm going to be taking some time today, and I'm going to be actually discussing a bit about the Excelsior and Transwarp drive. And the reason I'm going to kind of combine these two together is because, well, both are really closely related, and I think the first place to really start with is beginning with the lore. Wait a minute. Hold on a second here. That ain't right. All right, there we go. Beginning with the lore. Sorry, folks. I'm old and shit. Of the Excelsior itself, because they are so closely tied together. Now, the Excelsior actually entered service as NX-2000 in the year 2285. And essentially, NX is the prototype designation that the Federation uses for ships. And of course, since this is the Excelsior, the ship itself is the Excelsior class, being the first off the line. Only one ship never really followed that, and that was the NX class. Now, this ship would be under command of Captain Styles, and actually, we get to see it quite a bit in the movie Search for Spock, because, well, actually, I won't say quite a bit, but it was actually launched to actually pursue the Enterprise. However, Montgomery Scott, as he puts it best, if once you complicate the plumbing, it's easy to gum up the works. And that's essentially what he did, was sabotage the transwarp drive on the NX-2000, which pretty much let a damaged Enterprise get away. And essentially, because of this failure, the NX-2000, or the USS Excelsior, actually spent the next 2 years at space dock, having several things done to it. It's actually unclear everything that they've done to it, but I would argue they probably replaced the prototype transwarp drive, because the next time we would actually see the Excelsior is actually in the film Star Trek: The Undiscovered Country. Mind you, this is like 3 movies later, so it's quite a bit of time. And this time that we do see it is under the designation NCC 2000. So the Excelsior is essentially the flagship of the line, but instead of having the prototype NX designation, it has been changed to NCC, which makes me think that they actually got rid of the transwarp drive. Or at least sort of, maybe. I'll get into that more here in a bit when I get into the transwarp drive. And at this time, it would actually be under command of Captain Sulu, and this was 2287 was the events of Undiscovered Country. And of course, we would actually get to see the Excelsior fight alongside the Enterprise A, and the two ships together would actually destroy a prototype Klingon bird of prey in that film, over Kittimer. Now, while this would actually be the last voyage for the Enterprise, this was actually well, let me rephrase that. It was the last voyage of the Enterprise A. We would see other versions of the Enterprise down the road, but the Excelsior itself would actually continue service until 2320, and actually the whole time it would remain under command of Captain Sulu, and it would finally be retired in 2320 to the Fleet Museum at Athen Prime. And actually, the Excelsior could still be seen at the museum as late as 2401. Now, I want to take some time to get more into the transwarp drive. And there's actually a few issues that I see with the whole transwarp drive thing. The first thing is it's never really made clear what transwarp drive is supposed to be. I don't know. Maybe it's like having Trans Am or something like that. You know, it's like Trans Am of space. Maybe it's just a faster warp drive. They just never really make the great experiment very clear. And actually, I've seen people actually state that transwarp drive was actually a failure, and even when you look at the lore, it's actually pretty much put out there that transwarp drive, the great experiment itself, was a failure. However, I would actually argue to the complete opposite of that. See, you got to understand, between TOS and TNG, there was a huge jump in the warp speeds. Not the warp factor numbers, just the warp speeds. So actually, warp 9, by the revised warp speed chart, is actually way faster than warp 9 in the old TOS era warp fleet chart. I also want to take and highlight something here. If you look, the Enterprise A is on here. I want to point that out because I have a bit of a theory about the Enterprise A and the warp sound, because actually if you go back and watch the films, the last time you see the Enterprise is in the search for Spock, and the ship is destroyed in the search for Spock, and then the Enterprise A returns. Well, sorry, the Enterprise A is first unveiled in Star Trek The Final Frontier, as well as we get to see the Enterprise A once again in Undiscovered Country. And the warp sound actually changes in those films. Actually, if I remember correctly, I think it might have been The Final Frontier, but it may not have been until Undiscovered Country that the sound of the warp engine actually changes. And actually, when you go back and watch Undiscovered Country, the Enterprise A and the Excelsior has the same warp engine sounds, which actually makes me believe that the Excelsior was the key for changing the warp speed factors for a few different reasons. One is the warp speed chart I showed you there, as well as the huge leap in warp speed itself, what speed each factor can achieve. Now, the next thing that I think is a serious key to the whole transwarp drive, the great experiment, if you will, is actually the Enterprise D and its warp core, because the warp cores completely changed the design, the structure of them, how much power output they're putting out, the whole 9 yards completely changed by the era of the Next Generation. So I would actually argue that, sure, maybe in the Federation's eyes, the great experiment was actually a great failure, but they did achieve something with their experiment, because being able to get from point A to point B in space a whole lot faster is a whole lot better in many cases. Now, I do want to throw out one more thing here quick before I go, because I know people are going to say, what about Voyager? I know with Star Trek Voyager, transwarp was used, well, it pretty much, it was used so much in Star Trek Voyager that it became a throwaway term at that point. I am actually not going to discuss transwarp drive or transwarp and Star Trek Voyager, because I think the nature of transwarp in Star Trek Voyager is completely different than the great experiment that we see in the films, particularly beginning with Search for Spock, which is Star Trek 3. Anyway, folks, I'm going to wrap up today's video at that. Hopefully you all enjoyed it. Gave you a nice little primer and some thoughts here about various different things when it comes to the Excelsior and Transwarp drive. But anyway, that's it for me. Have yourselves a wonderful day.